You don't need a supermarket to survive, and you don't need electricity, refrigerated supply chains, or constant deliveries moving across continents. Because over 2,000 years ago, entire families lived, ate, and sustained themselves using a system that didn't depend on any of those things. A system that didn't collapse when transportation failed or when resources became scarce. A system that quietly produced food season after season with minimal intervention. And the strange part is that this system still exists today, functioning on the exact same principles. Yet most people have never seriously considered it, because modern food has made survival feel automatic, effortless, and permanent, when in reality it is one of the most fragile systems we rely on, built on layers of logistics that must all function perfectly at the same time. Fuel must flow, trucks must move, roads must remain open, storage must stay powered, and supply must meet demand with almost no margin for disruption. And when any part of that chain breaks, even briefly, the illusion disappears. Shelves empty, options shrink, and people realize how little control they actually have over the systems feeding them. And that's where a different approach becomes not just interesting, but necessary. Because instead of asking how to store more food, the smarter question is how to create a system that continues producing food regardless of external conditions. A system that doesn't require constant input to survive. And that's where the concept of a food forest comes in. Not as a modern invention, but as a rediscovered method rooted in ancient practices. A system that mimics the structure of natural ecosystems while intentionally producing edible resources at every level. And at first glance, it doesn't look efficient in the way modern agriculture defines efficiency. There are no straight lines, no monocrops, no exposed soil, just layers of plants growing in what appears to be controlled disorder. But that apparent disorder is actually one of its greatest strengths, because it creates resilience through diversity and structure. A food forest works by stacking multiple layers of plant life vertically, maximizing the use of space, light, and nutrients, starting with the canopy layer made up of tall fruit and nut trees that capture the majority of sunlight. Beneath them, the understory layer of smaller fruit trees adapted to partial shade, followed by shrubs such as berries and medicinal plants that fill the mid-level space. Then herbaceous plants that provide additional food and nutrients. Ground cover that protects the soil from erosion and retains moisture. Root crops growing beneath the surface, adding another dimension of productivity. And finally, climbing vines that use existing structures to grow upward without competing for ground space. Creating a 7-layer system where every level contributes to the overall output. And more importantly, every level supports the others, forming a network rather than isolated components. And that network is what makes the system stable, because instead of relying on a single crop or a single input, it distributes risk across multiple elements. If one plant fails, continue to produce. If one layer struggles, another compensates, creating redundancy that modern systems often lack. And beyond structure, there are processes happening that most people never see. Trees providing shade that regulates temperature and reduces water evaporation, roots anchoring the soil and preventing nutrient loss, fallen leaves decomposing into organic matter that feeds microorganisms, insects pollinating plants while also acting as natural pest control, fungi forming underground networks that transfer nutrients between plants, and water cycling naturally through the system rather than being constantly added and lost. And over time, these interactions create a feedback loop where the system becomes more efficient and more productive without additional input, which is the exact opposite of modern agriculture, where soil becomes depleted and requires increasing levels of intervention just to maintain output. And this difference is critical in a survival scenario because it determines whether a system improves or degrades over time, whether it becomes easier or harder to maintain, and whether it can function independently or requires constant support. And independence is where the real advantage lies. Because once a food forest is established, it doesn't need fuel to operate. It doesn't rely on electricity. It doesn't require daily planting schedules or precise timing. It continues producing food quietly in the background, often without drawing attention. And that matters because visibility can be a risk in unstable environments. A system that looks like a natural landscape is less likely to be targeted or disrupted, adding another layer of security that goes beyond production itself.
But there is another factor that makes this system even more powerful, and that is its ability to adapt. Because unlike rigid systems that break under stress, a food forest can shift and rebalance as conditions change. Plants that are better suited to new conditions begin to dominate, while others decline, maintaining overall stability even as individual components change. And this adaptability is something most
survival strategies fail to consider because they focus on fixed plans rather than dynamic systems, and when conditions change, those plans often fail. But a system that can adjust on its own reduces the need for constant decision-making and intervention, allowing it to continue functioning even when human input is limited. And yet, despite all these advantages, there is a reason why most people don't adopt this method, and that reason is time. Because a food forest is not an instant solution. It requires planning, understanding, and patience. It takes years to mature into a fully functioning system, and during that time, it may not produce at maximum capacity, which makes it less appealing in a world that prioritizes immediate results. But that same delay is what gives it strength, because systems that develop slowly tend to be more stable, more integrated, and more resilient in the long run. And this creates a fundamental trade-off between speed and sustainability, between quick output and long-term reliability. And most people choose speed without realizing the cost, because fast systems often require constant maintenance and are more vulnerable to failure, while slower systems build internal stability that reduces the need for intervention over time. And this is where the concept becomes more than just agriculture. It becomes a way of thinking about survival itself, shifting the focus from short-term fixes to long-term systems, from controlling every variable to designing structures that can function without constant control. And once you understand that, you start to see the difference between systems that survive temporarily and systems that endure. Because enduring systems are not built on perfection. They are built on balance, on redundancy, on the ability to absorb disruption without collapsing. And that's why this 2,000-year-old method is still relevant today. Not because it is outdated or primitive, but because it solves a problem that modern systems often ignore. The problem of long-term resilience, the ability to continue producing resources under unpredictable conditions without requiring perfect inputs. And when you look at it from that perspective, it stops being just a historical technique and becomes a blueprint, a model for designing systems that can survive not just for days or weeks, but for years. And maybe the most important lesson it offers is this, that survival is not about reacting to failure after it happens, it's about designing systems where failure is less likely to occur in the first place. Systems that don't depend on fragile connections, systems that don't require constant correction, systems that align with natural processes instead of fighting them. Because the closer a system is to nature, the more stable it tends to be. And that stability is what allows it to persist across generations, across changing conditions, across disruptions that would destroy less balanced systems. And that is why something created thousands of years ago can still outperform many modern approaches today. Because it was built on principles that don't change, principles of energy flow, resource cycling, diversity, and balance. And once those principles are in place, the system can sustain itself with minimal input, quietly producing food, maintaining soil health, and supporting life without constant oversight. And in a world where most systems are becoming more complex and more fragile at the same time, there is something powerful about a system that becomes simpler and stronger as it grows. Something that doesn't need to be constantly fixed because it is designed to function. And that's the real difference between temporary solutions and lasting ones. Because temporary solutions solve immediate problems, but often create new ones, while lasting systems reduce the number of problems that can occur at all. And that is what makes this 2,000-year-old food system so valuable, not just as a method of growing food, but as a framework for thinking about resilience, about independence, about what it really means to survive when external systems fail. Because in the end, survival is not determined by how much you have stored. It's determined by how well your systems continue to function when everything else stops. And the systems that last are not the ones that fight against nature, they are the ones that understand it, align with it, and use it as a foundation rather than an obstacle. Because when you do that, you are no longer relying on constant input to survive. You are creating a system that can sustain itself. And that is the difference between surviving for a moment and surviving long term.
because survival isn't luck, it's math.